Hello, world. Welcome to another exciting episode of the Little Bit Different podcast with your host, Corey Sterling. I hope this finds you well wherever you may be in the world, whatever you're doing. Thanks so much for tuning in and enjoying. I just have the most fun ever recording these podcasts and also thinking about what to chat about. And this week I want to talk about my experiences working in the NFL for the Oakland Raiders, going to 2 Super Bowls, being on the field of the Super Bowl, being in the locker room after 2 Super Bowl games, and also going to London to work with the NFL UK and what I learned during this process. Part of why I think it's cool and fun and funny to record an episode like this is, and I don't know if this resonates with you, but I realize as I grow older and have different experiences in my life, there are parts of my former life with my former self that I just absolutely, completely forget about. And I was recently in North America, and with someone the conversation came up that I used to work in the NFL, and I was like, oh yeah, that was also 2 years of my life. And I just forgot that I had done all of these things. So even as you're listening, maybe there are things that you've done in your life that you totally, completely forgot about. And now you're remembering them. And I think that we each have stories to share. And I think that there's a lot to be learned from the stories that we have from our life. And definitely this chapter in my life taught me a lot. And so I think that the benefit of experiences that we have in our lives partially is that we get to see how they form who we are today and how they contribute to our character and also what we drew and learned from them. So the intention of this episode is to share about one of the cooler experiences of my life that came to me at a very young age and that taught me a lot about developing the appropriate skill set to in the future become an entrepreneur and to build my own business and to leverage the tools that I developed in a professional sports organization to then create my dream life, which is currently what I'm doing. And so the first part of the story, really, I think I just want to explain how I got into working with the Oakland Raiders at the time and what that process was like, because it was one of the only jobs that I ever had where while I was in the job, I would just see every single day, probably not hundreds of applications every day, but let's say over the course of a year, like hundreds of applications for people who wanted my job. And it was a super, super cool job. And it was very, very difficult to get. And then it's also so underwhelming because when you have that job, you're like, this is what everybody wants to do. But I guess that makes sense in some ways. So I finished my undergraduate degree. At the beginning of my last semester, I was thinking that big question, what am I going to do with my life? I was 19 years old. I was about to get a Bachelor of Arts. And I had zero direction. I was awesome at partying. And I loved sports. I've always loved sports. And I thought, why not try to find a way to work in sports somehow? And my parents, as always, were incredibly supportive. And, their attitude wasn't, oh, go take a job at some company that you don't like. They've always pursued me, encouraged me to pursue what it is that I love and whatever it is that I want to do. And I found a couple of programs for a master's degree to get a degree in sport management. And I reached out to a couple of the schools, and one school at the University of San Francisco offered me a scholarship to come do a master's in sport management. And this was just perfect. It was awesome. It was also in the history of the school. They had never, it's so silly. They'd never offered anyone an entry scholarship, but for some reason they chose me to be the person to do that with. And I accepted and I went. And essentially the first, I could spend a lot of time even just talking about the first course that we took in that master's of sport management. It was taught by a guy named Rich Cellini, And he basically, the Master's in Sport Management was not a very scholastic degree. It was an extremely practical degree. And actually, when I think about my career later on in any of the jobs that I've had, including interviewing at big law firms and getting those jobs and how I've built my own business, there was so much benefit from that first class, which was basically how to network. And the class begins essentially by him explaining the importance of being a good public speaker. And he would just freak out if anyone would ever use the word when they're speaking. And he would teach us how to network and how to build connections, and that your network is everything that you have. And Cellini, he's a big character within the program. He's sort of infamous as known as being challenging and wasn't the friendliest, but he definitely was one of those college professors that made such a positive impact in life because he provided and taught so many skills. So in his first class, basically, I think we read a John Wooden book, and it's really cute because everything's sports related. So they're teaching you all of these principles about life and leadership through sports examples. And firstly, I'm like, fuck yeah, I'm definitely in the right place. This is perfect for a 19-year-old Corey. But also just really the importance of the practical skills. And what I really took from the first class was communication and networking. And what he basically taught us a process of how to get in touch with anyone that you want. And I think one of the first tasks we got was that everyone in class had to choose some person in some organization who they wanted to get in touch with, have a conversation with, what he calls informational interviews. And then you have to actually put that into practice and find a way to make it happen. And I think I chose a CEO not the CEO of ESPN, but some executive in communications at ESPN. And I ended up becoming friends with her, and I found a way, and there's a whole process to utilize informational interviews to be in connection and communication with anyone that it is that you want. So while all of this was happening, when you start the class, it's a very incestual group in the Bay Area of a lot of professionals who work in sports are people who went through the USF program. And that's really, I think, one of the biggest strengths of the program. If you really want to get a job in the Bay Area, then you would go through the program. So what happens is people go through the program, graduate, get jobs in professional sports, and then you have to do internships. I don't think you have to do internships, but they encourage you to do internships. But the internships are really gold because that's where you get an opportunity to start building a network and start developing these skills that you need. And then also, usually the people who are hiring are people who went to the school. I guess this is sort of a microcosm for how society works. But the people who are hiring went to the school, see that you're a student, understand, have been in the same position, and then they'll interview you for an internship, which gives you much more preferential treatment than anyone on the outside. So an opportunity came up with the Raiders, which was like so super cool. I did a first interview with a girl named Farnoosh, who was lovely, and there was an internship available in the internet department in the year 2007. Things were just a little bit different back then. And the interview with her went well, and then she connected me with her boss, who was a guy named Jerry Knack, and he invited me to training camp for one day, and they had a job. They had an internship opportunity for the first season. It was an unpaid internship for the first season, and that was to be a writer for the website. So he wanted to see if I would be able to write and go to games and basically be an internal marketing writer for the team and write the articles for the Game Day magazine and all of that sort of stuff. So on my first assignment, the first trial, I went to training camp with the Oakland Raiders in Napa Valley. That was an absolutely surreal experience. I couldn't believe it. It was like, a little Canadian boy, 19 years old, just started a master's degree, And 5 weeks later, I'm at training camp watching NFL practice, interviewing players. And he basically just said, like, watch practice today, interview whoever you want. Like, they gave me a lanyard to go talk to guys, and I want to see what you write. Obviously, I had no idea. I'd never done any of this before. So I looked on the website of what they wrote the year before. I guess this is like a human ChatGPT thing. And I basically just wrote a different version of what they wrote the year before, choosing my quotes, looking at the formatting of how they wrote stuff. And he was actually really, really impressed. He was like, wow, you really, it's, you know, it's not perfect, but this is really our style, and you've captured it, and you've got it, and you know it. And so he offered me the internship. And then I was going to, I think when I started, I was going a couple of times a week during training camp. I think I came back up to training camp that year. And then during the season, I think I was in 3 or 4 days a week in the office unpaid. Now, this was my first real proper job out of college. And what's interesting is that until you have a breadth of experience in your life, you're unable to recognize what something dysfunctional is, right? So until you sort of have like a dysfunctional relationship, and then afterwards you have a healthy relationship, you can't really truly understand what dysfunction is and what it looks like. But this happened in 2007. I was with the Raiders for 2007, 2008, 2009, and they were a terrible team. During those years, I think they went 3-13, 4-12, just like bad. And in addition to the team being bad, the organization was, wow, it was a really, really awful place to be, and a strange place to work. It didn't mean that I didn't have friends and there weren't a lot of amazing people and that the experiences weren't incredible, but the organization for a worker was just really bad. This was at the end of Al Davis, who we called Mr. Davis. It was at the end of his life as the owner of the Raiders. And there was a woman named Amy Trask who was the CEO, but the culture at the organization was very, very bad, uncomfortable. But I didn't know that. I was like, holy smokes, I'm in the NFL. You can do whatever you want to me. I don't really care. Or, you know, people can act however they're going to act, and I don't care. And I loved it. I had the best time of my life. When I look back on it, I can see how dysfunctional it was. But at the time, I loved it. And essentially, I think I started unpaid, then they paid me half-time, then I got promoted to full-time. But I basically, my job was to go to the Raiders building 5 days a week and for home games, and to watch practice, to interview players, and just basically generate content for the team. Interview coaches, do specials, watch what was happening. And I can tell you, one of the biggest challenges as a writer was learning to put positive spins on such dire situations. It would be like, the long snapper got selected to the Pro Bowl. Like, these are the things that we would have to celebrate, or try to always put out good information to the media. And those were the sorts of things that I would have to talk about and write about, because there was nothing good happening with that team. But that was my job, and I loved it, and it was so cool. But then as I started working with the Raiders, I realized that there would be more opportunities for me to create a bigger network and see different things and participate in different ways. So now obviously the juicy stuff is, how was I able to go from, being a part-time intern in the internet department to getting to the side of the Super Bowl. And this was really, it was crazy because it seemed so surreal, but also so strongly reinforced the idea of the American dream, which I'm sure everyone who's listening knows that I'm Canadian. And there's just something about the United States where you always hear in the movies about the American dream and that anything's possible. And I actually was able to live it myself. And the way that I was able to get to the Super Bowl was just purely by way of networking. and learning how the networking game works, and also realizing that once you're in the door with an organization, it's so much easier to do incredible and challenging things that otherwise you'd have no access to. But the important thing is just getting your foot in the door. So for me, because I had an official email address at Raiders.com, I had a signature email box. So I looked to anyone who didn't know anything about me, I looked totally legit. And when I was working game days, there was another guy named Chris who also did game days with the Niners. And he was the one who's like, hey man, the Raiders are such a bad organization. The Niners everything's so much better there and everyone's so much nicer. They're so much more functional. I'm like, I don't know, I'm 19. I have no idea what's going on. I'm just happy to be there. So I'm like, oh yeah. And then he told me Chris went to the Super Bowl the year before. And I was like, what? You went to the Super Bowl? And he's like, yeah, you can work for NFL Media Services. The Niners make it really easy. He's like, there's two guys who choose basically all of the help for NFL Media Services for the Super Bowl. The way that it works is the NFL is a massive marketing publicity machine. And during the Super Bowl, they recruit help from other members of different public relations or marketing teams. Like all of the teams will send volunteers for the Super Bowl to help because there's just so much going on and the NFL has to put all of this out there. So he's like, hey, there are these two guys who basically choose everything. You should find a way to get in contact with them. One of the guys works for the Broncos. So I was like, cool, the Broncos are coming in 2 weeks. He's just like, whatever happens, find that guy and talk to that guy. So I go, I find that guy on game day. I just go up, I say, hi, my name's Corey Sterling. I'm an intern with the Raiders. I'm very happy to meet you. You know, is there anything I can do to help you? Something like that. And he's like, oh, hi, no, thank you, everything's good. 4 seconds. But now I've spoken with the guy. So then what I do is I get the name from my other friend. And because it's the NFL, everything's internal at this point. So again, I have access to the network. And then I just write an email to the other guy. And I say, hi, my name's Corey Sterling. I recently was speaking with person X, and I'm not going to share anyone's names, but I was recently speaking with person X. And I also understand that you're responsible for Super Bowl help. Is there anything, if you need any bodies, I'm here to be available. Let me know the dates, whatever. Guy responds back in 2 minutes. Oh, hey, Corey, it's great that you know X. Yeah, we're interested we're always looking for help for the Super Bowl. I'll put you on the list. And the Super Bowl is going to be January, February. This is October. And I'm just like, what? And I was like, I wanted to respond and be like, oh, what list? Can you confirm? Does this mean I'm coming? Should I book a flight? But I didn't send any of that. I was just like, oh, okay. I just said, thank you so much. I'll wait for more information. And then I spoke to my boy, Chris. I'm like, Chris, how does this work? And he's like, just wait. And then, 2 or 3 weeks before the Super Bowl, just send a follow-up and ask for confirmation. I did that exactly, and then he's like, hey, cool, this person's gonna be your lead, this is the day that you should arrive, this is when you should leave, and just basically, he's like, you're coming to the Super Bowl. And the only reason why this happened was, A, because I knew someone who had done it, and they had told me how, and B, I was already inside a very, very exclusive group that was able to basically, because I was in and worked for a team, I was able to go. That's it. Like, A, someone told me how. B, I was already in the group. And then C, just like learning how to leveraging networking, where I wasn't dishonest with anything I wrote, but I just said, hey, I recently met with this person, giving off the impression maybe of something different, that me and this person had a relationship or that we knew each other. But basically it's like the secret password at a speakeasy. I was like, hey, I know person X. And they're like, awesome, you're in. Then I go to the Super Bowl. Obviously, I work my butt off. I make friends with everyone. And have an amazing experience. That game was the Patriots and Giants, and I was on the sideline when David Tyree made that catch. And for NFL Media Services, part of what your job on the Super Bowl is you have to interview certain players before they go speak to the general media to try to get quotes out as quickly as possible. I can say during that Super Bowl week, I had the best time ever. I made friends from all these different teams in the NFL. But most importantly, I just learned about top-level professionalism. Like, what does it look like to be a professional, how to be a professional, and what it means to show up, to shut up, to do the work, look smart, be early, all of those sorts of things that really, really have helped propel me so much later in my life. For that game, for the first Super Bowl, it was Patriots-Giants, and I think there were 2 New England Patriot players. This was also the year the Patriots were it was Deflategate year, or Spygate, I forget which one, but the Patriots were undefeated, and they were on the verge of pulling off being the first undefeated team ever to win a Super Bowl. I think the Dolphins did it also, but there was a lot of hype, there was a lot of drama around it. And I had to interview 2 New England Patriot defensive players. Asante Samuel was one of them. There was another guy, Randall Gay II. And it's crazy because your job is to, escort them off the field to make sure that they don't speak to anyone else, and then interview them and then transcribe it and then send it out to different NFL media services, like to media outlets, as soon as possible. I knew before the game that I had 2 Patriots players. I was obviously hoping for them to win, but it didn't happen. So I was in the locker room with Tom Brady and Randy Moss, and like just the energy in that locker room after they had lost the Super Bowl was crazy to experience. The second year I went to the Super Bowl because I maintained all of these good relationships. The second year it was the Cardinals and the Steelers, where the Steelers won on their final drive. And in that game, I just had winning locker room. So that meant that no matter what happened, I had to go to the team that won and interview whoever I could. I interviewed the owner, who was really nice. And Hines Ward was a wide receiver for Pittsburgh. I actually spoke to him on the field while the confetti was coming down. And I'm sure he and I both remember that moment. But those were my Super Bowl moments. I also I remember, it's so funny because when you're in that environment, you have no idea who anyone is. There's just so many people that you don't know who's important and who's not. So you're sort of just all friendly. And I didn't know how to tie a tie. At this point, I'm 20 years old. I didn't know how to tie a tie. And I asked some British guy, I was like, hey, do you mind helping me tie a tie? And he did it. And he was such a lovely man. His name is David Tossell. And he ended up being the head of the UK game in the NFL that took place at Wembley Stadium. And he and I became buddies, and he's like, if you want to come over and help for the NFL UK game, you can. They gave me tickets. I gave them to my friends. I had a super cool experience. And that was my life for 2 years, essentially, was going to different stadiums around the world, or Super Bowls, or different teams, meeting all of these players, being in locker rooms, watching games from the sidelines. And my highlight from my whole NFL working career was catching punts on the field before the game. So my buddy Scott Fink worked for the Raiders. He did all of the travel. Each team supplies their own ball boys. And one day he just came to my office. He's like, hey, do you want to be a ball boy for this week's away game? I was like, yeah. So then I was on the field, you wear a vest with an X on it. You hold the balls of your team. You have a meeting with the referees before the game. And part of it was just being part of warm-ups. So it was Shane Leckler was the punter for the Raiders at the time. He was shagging balls, and I would catch them. And I would just be on the field sort of warming up before an NFL game. It sounds so silly when I say this out loud and remember that used to be my life. But those were the experiences that I had, and they were really, really beautiful. And so I was living the American dream. I was living my version of it. You know, a little boy. I always refer to myself as a little boy. I think I was still tall back then, but I just felt like a really young boy. Showed up to the United States, didn't know anyone. I think like July 5th maybe was when our program started. And I don't know, however many weeks later, 3 or 4 or 5 weeks later, I'm at NFL training camp. Then I have a gig with an NFL team. Then I'm at the Super Bowl. And I'm like, firstly, wow, dreams totally can come true. It was beyond my wildest expectation of what I had ever thought was possible. And also just my belief in the American dream and my appreciation for the United States and for its culture, and specifically the sports culture, and just the opportunities that are available to people in that country is something that I'll never forget. Now, obviously, I had stopped working with the Raiders, and during my time there, I built a massive network in the Bay Area, and I think there's a couple of things to talk about, just returning to this idea of dysfunction and not being able to realize what is dysfunctional until you have other experiences. At the time, the Raiders, and being a staff member at the Raiders was all I knew. It's not a normal place, and after I would work at other organizations and have different experiences around the world in other companies with other cultures, and when I look back, for sure it was the most bizarre, strangest, unfriendly culture. And it all really came from the top down at that particular time. At the time, I couldn't know it. I just knew something was wrong, where I was like, probably shouldn't feel it this way. Also, when I'd go to the Super Bowl, both years they told me I was the first person ever from the Raiders organization to come help out. Because the Raiders were sort of, I don't know if they still are, but they used to be sort of the outcast, and Al Davis had a lawsuit with the NFL some decades before. But I would just hear the stories and experiences of other people's at other teams, and I was like, wow, that sounds super cool. That's really nice. Like, oh, I didn't know that people do that. And at the Raiders, everything was done differently. So I wasn't able to really appreciate the dysfunction at the moment until years later, when I realized, wow, that was a really messed up place to be. Despite how friendly and lovely, like I had so many friends, I felt at home there, but as an organization, it was definitely poorly run, as reflected by the performances of the team, which was sort of symbolic or representative of that. But I think what's also important is to share when I realized that I didn't want to work in professional sports any longer. I wanted to do more interesting things with my life. And as cool as it was to work in professional sports, maybe it's because I achieved what I achieved so quickly, having gone from unpaid to part-time to full-time to all of these different experiences. I'll never forget just always thinking that I believed there was something more out there in the world. And obviously I'd been a traveler at this point. I'd started traveling at 19 or 18. Maybe 2 years before, 2005, 2006 was my big year of travel. And I'll never forget that there were two moments that to me were really indicative that continuing to work in the NFL was not the right path. One of them was when a promotion came up. The team wanted to hire internally. I was top of the list for the candidates. I was in Italy visiting my buddy Giovanni. And I wrote my would-be boss at the time an email withdrawing my name from the candidates list. And looking back, that's the best decision that I ever made. At the time, it was a very, very difficult decision to make because it's so hard to get the job. Promotions don't come up that often. But also I knew that organization was the type of place, and I think most organizations, that if there's an opportunity that comes up and you don't take it, they take that personally a lot. And so that was the beginning of the end for me, because they're like, hey, there's a job here, a full-time gig, promotion, more responsibility. but I was too curious about the world. I was too curious about life to think to myself, okay, I'm going to now move closer. I'll move to Alameda County, California, and I'm going to spend 6 days a week at Raiders headquarters for such a bad team, such a dysfunctional team, and this is how I'm going to spend my life. And like the moment really crystallized for me when it was the off season, it was something, and I remember I went in and the guy who took the job that I withdrew the candidacy from, he was just like sitting watching NFL Network. It was like Tuesday at 2 p.m. in the off season, and I was just like, fuck this. I can't do this. This isn't who I am. And I think ultimately what I realized for myself is it's a big world. There's a lot of experiences out there. There's a lot of possibilities out there. And that for me, I wouldn't be satisfied just, following football, having my pulse on football forever. And so at that point, I think it was the start of 2009, and I was let go from the Raiders. When my boss sent me a message, there was some form of financial crisis that was taking place, and I was in South Korea, which, people who work for the Raiders, they spend their time in the building. They're not going to Seoul. And I was in South Korea, and my boss just sent me an email, and he's like, hey, man, like, where are you? They're starting to cut jobs. I'm going to bat for you. You're not even in the building. People are losing their jobs. Where are you? And I was like, hey, I'm in South Korea. Hey, I'm in South Korea. Annyeonghaseyo. But that's where I was at the time, and I think it was definitely for the best. And what I learned also is that it's awesome to have dreams. It's awesome to have passions like sport. But I saw very, very clearly that I loved sports as a fan, and working in sports was very, very different. And that I had an opportunity. I did some work with the San Jose Sharks and a local radio station and media, so I'd interview Joe Thornton and talk to him about the Tragically Hip, and I'd go to Sharks playoffs games. I had a media pass for their whole playoff run. They ended up, I think they got swept, or they lost unexpectedly in the first round, even though I think they were the number 1 or number 2 seed, which sort of sucked because I had tickets for their whole playoff run. And when the Leafs came, I got to meet Cliff Fletcher and some other Leaf CEOs and the guy who does media for Leaf CEO. And it's crazy because when you're for Canadians, when you have NFL experience, like I met the guy who did the media for the Maple Leafs, and he was impressed with who I was, which is such a joke because, I love the Maple Leafs, and I had just gotten this gig with the NFL and whatever I'd done. And then I realized I interviewed with a couple of people at the NHL when I finished my degree, but I realized that I didn't want to work for the Maple Leafs. The Maple Leafs are my family's team, they're my team, and I didn't want to ruin what I had, that special feeling of being a fan and loving the team and going to the games, because I think after I left the Raiders, I didn't watch the NFL for 4 or 5 years, and now I'm back to being a fan again, but it changes. And I think what it also taught me is that sometimes it's better to let heroes be heroes and let dreams be dreams. And I ended up making one of the best decisions of my life afterward. After I completed my degree, I went to work in the Middle East for a year on a sports for peace nonprofit, which is what I'll talk about in my next episode. But it was a really, really beautiful experience working in the NFL, the opportunity that I had. So in summing all of this up, firstly, I just hope it's an entertaining story. Like I started off by saying, sometimes we forget the things that happen in our lives happen to us. And who I am today, the online lawyer, kite surfer, retreat organizer, I think back to the NFL and I laugh. But also just that experience and the benefit of learning how to network, how to communicate, how to be a professional, all of that have just paid off 1,000-fold in my life. So Whatever it is that you do, stay different, embrace and love your unique path, and love you very much. Thanks for listening. I hope you had fun.